Dear listeners, welcome to The Curious Case. I'm Davis, and it's lovely to have you here again tonight. Where are you listening from? And tell me, was your day calm or busy? Write me a note in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Now, let's begin. The clock of Street Mary Me struck 7. Each note rolled through the damp evening air. Rain tapped against the vicarage windows. Inside, yellow lamplight softened every shadow. The Women's Guild gathered, coats steaming faintly near the stove. Wool, rain, and polish mixed in the air. Mrs. Ellen Priest poured tea with cheerful precision. "Strong or weak?" she asked, passing cups down the table. Laughter moved gently through the room, comfortable, ordinary. Miss Marple sat near the hearth, knitting balanced on her knees. She listened more than she spoke, as always. Threads clicked, voices overlapped. Teaspoons chimed, all perfectly familiar. Then she paused. A faint smell brushed past her, not unpleasant, almost sweet, like burnt sugar, too thick, too heavy, not kitchen smoke. Her eyes drifted toward the stove. The flame burned steady, blue and calm. The kettle puffed once, then quieted. Nothing amiss there. She turned slightly. Ellen Priest refilled the large brown teapot, laughing over some remark about hymn books. Steam curled from the spout, drifting low instead of high. Odd. Steam should rise. This slid sideways, hugging the tablecloth before thinning away. Miss Marple's knitting needles stilled, her head tilted. She took another slow breath. That scent again, sweet at first, then sharp underneath like singed cloth. The others noticed nothing. Mrs. Fielding discussed next week's raffle. Mavis Green counted coins for biscuits. Someone sneezed. Someone shushed her. Domestic life went on, perfectly self-absorbed. Outside, the rain strengthened, soft on the roof, a kind of steady heartbeat. Inside, the sweet smoke thickened by degrees. Miss Marple leaned closer to the table. Her eyes settled on the teapot itself. Tiny bubbles formed around the rim, though no one had added water. The glaze darkened at the handle, faintly blistered. Heat was rising from within, not beneath. Ellen Priest wiped her brow. "Goodness, it's warm tonight," she said. Her hand hovered near the pot, then pulled back with a start. "Hotter than it ought to be." The laughter paused. A few heads turned. Someone muttered that the stove must be too close. Miss Marple said nothing. She only watched the steam curl and fade, her gaze steady, thoughtful. There was nothing visible to fear. No flame, no smoke worth naming. Yet the smell grew stronger thick now, sweet and bitter together. A smell that didn't belong in tea. She made a small note in her mind, as she always did when something felt out of pattern. Calmly, quietly, she filed it away. And as the clock struck the quarter hour, Miss Marple realized the truth. The smell wasn't coming from the stove, but from the teapot. Ellen Priest lifted the pot. Steam hissed in a strange, uneven rhythm, not the gentle sigh of boiling water. This was sharper, a hiss that rose and broke like a whisper through a crack. The lid rattled. Metal against ceramic. Too much pressure for a simple pot of tea. Her face twisted in surprise. "Good heavens," she began. Then it happened. A thick puff escaped the spout. Brown, curling, and wrong. It didn't smell of tea, it smelled chemical. Sharp at the nose, sweet behind the throat. A smell that clung. Mrs. Dawes coughed first. A short, startled sound. Then another woman followed, eyes watering, handkerchief pressed to her mouth. Someone cried, "Open the windows." Chairs scraped. A rush of movement. Hands tugged at the latches. Cold, rain-soaked air poured in, swirling the fumes away. Miss Marple didn't move. Her eyes were on the table. Every detail counted. The pot's base glowed faintly red at the rim. A scorch mark darkened the linen beneath it. She leaned closer. The edge of her knitting needle brushed the mark. Sticky. Residue clung to the metal tip. She sniffed the air again. It bit at the nose but dulled quickly. Like fuel burnt halfway. Not cooking oil, not lamp smoke. Something else. "Ellen, dear," she said softly. Perhaps set it down carefully. Ellen obeyed, lowering the pot onto the sideboard. Her hands trembled. What? What is it? Her voice wavered. It's boiling itself. Steam rose once more, thicker now. Inside, a dark sludge bubbled along the rim. Not leaves, not tea. Something that glittered faintly as it cooled. Marple saw the shimmer, tiny grains catching the light. Too fine for sugar, too dull for salt. Crystals. The women whispered behind her. Bad kettle. Rust. Some fool's prank. Misses. Fielding's voice sliced through the noise. That's enough. It's nothing dangerous. A reaction, perhaps. Minerals in the water. She forced a smile. We'll have a fresh pot made. But her hand closed the cupboard sharply. Too sharply. And she avoided looking at the table. Miss Marple said nothing. Her gaze returned to the scorch mark. She pressed one finger near the edge. Warm. Almost sticky again. And at the center, a faint metallic glimmer remained. She rolled the thought over like a bead in her mind. A reaction. Misses, Fielding said. Yes, but reactions have ingredients, and ingredients have hands behind them. The rain outside softened. The smell thinned but lingered in the cloth, in the air, in the back of the throat. Something chemical, not culinary. She gathered her knitting bag. The women still chattered nervously, eager to dismiss it all. Miss Marple glanced once more at the pot, silent now but wrong. Quiet things, she thought, caused the loudest trouble. And she knew, with that calm certainty of hers, that the night's real mystery had just begun. The smell still lingered, sweet and bitter, a scent that clung to the curtains and the cuffs of every woman in the hall. Mrs. Doris Fielding, chairwoman of the Street Merry Me Women's Guild, stood tall near the stove. Her pearls gleamed even under the weak lamplight. Her expression was brisk, composed, almost scolding. "Ladies," she said, voice crisp as starch, "there's no cause for alarm." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Something in the kettle, perhaps, or bad water. We'll not start gossip over a little smoke. Someone muttered. It wasn't little Doris, but the sound died quickly. No one ever argued with Mrs. Fielding for long. "Ellen, dear, open the back door, would you? Let the air through." Ellen obeyed, pale but silent. Rain swept in. The curtains fluttered. Cold air met the last curls of smoke, pushing them out into the dark. Mrs. Fielding clapped her hands once. "Right then. Let's have the tables tidied and the cloth changed. We can't have stains." Her tone was sharp, all command and no comfort. She reached for the cupboard key on its hook, a small brass key that glinted faintly. Miss Marple's eyes followed it. Mrs. Fielding unlocked the cupboard, placed the scorched teapot inside, and shut the door. Then, with a quick motion, she turned the key again. Click. Her hand trembled, just slightly. No one seemed to notice but Miss Marple. That tiny tremor told her more than a dozen words could. Control and fear often travel together, she thought. Mrs. Fielding turned, smiling too brightly. "No need to mention this to anyone. We'll not alarm the village. They do love a fuss." Her voice dropped lower. "And heaven knows. One whisper becomes 10 before morning." "Yes, Mrs. Fielding," several women murmured. The guild obeyed. Always. Ellen dabbed her eyes. Mavis folded the stained cloth, careful not to look at the cupboard. The others busied themselves with cups and saucers. Noise returned, small and nervous, a forced normalcy. Miss Marple packed her knitting with calm hands. She said nothing. It was not the time. But she saw everything Mrs. Fielding's forced composure, the way she guarded that cupboard, the way her glance flicked toward the door whenever someone spoke too loudly. The teapot had frightened her, not because it hissed, but because it revealed something she hadn't planned to reveal. When the room emptied, Mrs. Fielding lingered near the key hook. She looked around, then slipped the key into her handbag. A small act, almost invisible. But Miss Marple saw that too. Outside, rain still fell, quiet and steady. The church bell struck 8. The night felt heavier now. Miss Marple paused at the doorway, shawl drawn tight. Ellen whispered, "You think it's over?" Marple smiled faintly. "No, my dear. she said softly. People who silence others usually have something to hide. Morning came pale and grey. A thin mist hung over the village green. Miss Marple walked briskly, shawl wrapped close, her umbrella tapping the cobblestones. The vicarage hall stood quiet. The storm had passed, leaving puddles that mirrored the tower clock. Inside, the air still held the faint trace of smoke. Old wood, cold tea, damp cloth. She paused at the door. A key turned softly inside. Owen Little, the caretaker, emerged, wiping his hands on a rag. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, voice flat as always. "Back already? I thought last night gave you ladies enough excitement for a month." "I left my knitting," she said mildly. Her tone was gentle, but her eyes were moving, noting, measuring, remembering. He stepped aside, muttering about damp floors and poor ventilation. She entered. Chairs stacked. Tablecloth gone. Only the faint dark patch on the table remained, round as a halo. The smell was sharper here. Less sweet now, more chemical. Her steps carried her toward the sideboard. The cupboard stood closed, but she made no move to open it. Her attention shifted instead to the smaller table beneath the window. There, half covered by a folded paper, lay the guild's ledger. Miss Marple's fingers brushed the cover. A grey film dusted the surface. Not ordinary dust. It shimmered faintly in the light. She scraped a little with her fingernail. The residue clung to her skin like fine powder. She lifted it close to her eyes. Tiny crystals caught the light dull silver, pale gold. Not ash from paper, not soot from flame. She brought it near her nose. A faint tang. Sharp. Bitter. Almost metallic. It reminded her of old fireworks, the faint memory of bonfire nights long past. Owen Little came clomping back in, holding a wrench. "Boiler's out again," he said. "Needs new oil. Been saying it for months." He bent near the hearth, grumbling. "Fuel delivery late again. That's what happens when you trust the council." Miss Marple turned slightly. "Fuel delivery?" He nodded, not looking up. "Due Wednesday. Didn't come till Friday." Mrs. Fielding was none too pleased. Said she'd fetch a bit herself from Pratt's shop. "Paraffin," she said. "Just enough to keep the stove going." "Ah." Miss Marple's tone was mild, but her eyes had sharpened. A chair creaked softly beneath her hand. She glanced again at the grey dust. Paraffin and nitrate, fuel and spark. Simple things, when mixed, could do strange harm. She wiped her finger gently on her handkerchief. The crystals left a faint shimmer even on the cloth. Not kitchen ash, not paper soot, something made to burn slow, not fast, something that wanted to hide its purpose. She closed the ledger carefully and stepped back. "Thank you, Mr. Little," she said, her voice light. He looked up, puzzled, but she was already leaving. Outside, the mist thinned. The church bell struck 9. Miss Marple's steps slowed. She looked down at her handkerchief, at the faint sparkle left behind. And she whispered to herself, almost kindly, the ashes of a secret burned differently. The next morning broke clear and cold. A pale sun trembled behind thin clouds. Frost clung to the gate-posts, glittering faintly. Miss Marple made her way toward the post office. The smell of bread drifted from the bakery. The air felt still, too quiet for comfort. Quiet days often followed nights of trouble. Inside the small post office, warmth returned. Parcels lined the shelves in neat, tidy rows. The faint scent of ink and sealing wax hung in the air. Behind the counter stood Agnes Reed, sharp-eyed, cheerful, and endlessly observant. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she chirped. "Looking for a letter today?" "Not quite," said Miss Marple, smiling gently. "I wanted to ask about a parcel, one that may have arrived here a few days ago." Agnes tilted her head. "What sort of parcel?" "Addressed to Mrs. Doris Fielding. I understand she collects things for the guild. Cleaning supplies, perhaps." Agnes's expression brightened with recognition. "Oh, yes. Came in on Tuesday evening, marked cleaning compound. Heavy little box, that one. Brown paper tied with string. She fetched it herself the next morning." "The next morning?" Miss Marple repeated softly. "That would be Thursday?" "That's right," Agnes said. Funny thing, too, she said it was overdue. I remember her complaining about the delay. Miss Marple's brows lifted slightly. Delayed? Agnes nodded, leaning forward. The label said Special Order Fragile. She told me she needed it before the guild meeting. Said she couldn't clean the hall properly without it. Miss Marple gave a faint hum, the sort she used when a puzzle began to turn. Was it posted from London? From a supplier in Dover, according to the stamp. Agnes opened her ledger, running a finger down the neat columns. Yes, here it is. Household. Compound £1 tin. Collected by Mrs. D. Fielding, Thursday, 11:45. Was that the same morning the new teapot arrived at the vicarage hall? Agnes blinked. Why, yes. Owen Little came in that same day to sign for it. Said it was a donation from the guild. Lovely brown glaze, he told me. Miss Marple's knitting bag rested lightly on her arm. She didn't speak for a moment. The pieces were beginning to align, slow, quiet, inevitable. A parcel labelled cleaning compound, arriving the same day as a new teapot, both in Mrs. Fielding's hands, before nightfall. Strange timing, don't you think? She said softly. Agnes shrugged. Things cross in the post. Happens often enough. Yes, said Miss Marple, her tone mild. But when they cross too neatly, it's seldom chance. She thanked Agnes kindly and stepped back into the cold. The morning light had sharpened now. Each puddle reflected the sky like glass. At the corner she paused. The brown paper parcel, the cleaning compound, the perfect cover for something no one should ever mix. Miss Marple hummed again, very softly, as she walked, and under her breath almost a whisper. Sometimes murder comes wrapped in brown paper. The afternoon was brisk, dry, and clear. Miss Marple walked the narrow path toward the surgery. Bare hedges lined the lane, their thorns catching the winter light. She carried a small envelope inside her knitting bag, folded paper, sealed neatly, marked in her tidy hand. Residue from Vicarage Hall. Dr. Haydock looked up as she entered. He always greeted her with half suspicion, half affection. Well, Miss Marple, he said, pushing aside his spectacles, what small puzzle brings you here today? She smiled mildly. Oh, something quite harmless, I imagine. I found a little powder near a teapot, a curious sort of ash. He frowned, motioning her to sit. Let me see. She placed the envelope on his desk. He tapped it gently, spreading a pinch onto a white tray. Grey crystals speckled faintly with gold. He sniffed once, then took a thin spatula and touched it with a match. A brief hiss. A flash of pale flame. Then thick, grey smoke that lingered longer than it should. Haydock's eyebrows rose. Good heavens, where did this come from? The Vicarage Hall, she said softly. After the Women's Guild meeting, there was an incident with the teapot. He leaned back, thoughtful. This is no kitchen soot. It's a mixture of saltpeter and sugar, a sort of primitive smoke compound. I've seen it used by boys making fireworks in the fields. Ah, Miss Marple nodded slowly. Then it's a childish trick? He shrugged. In theory, yes. Perfectly simple to make. Saltpeter from a chemist, sugar from any kitchen. When heated together, they smolder, create thick smoke. Quite harmless in small doses. Dangerous in closed rooms, though. Her knitting needles clicked quietly in her lap. He continued. Used often enough to test chimneys or clear bees from barns. Not much else. She looked up, eyes calm, sharp. And what sort of person would think of using it at a tea meeting? He chuckled. A mischievous one. Or someone wanting to make a fuss. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Yes, mischief in small minds often hides mischief in larger ones. Haydock gave her a curious look. You think it's more than a prank? I think, she said gently, that intent hides itself in the ordinary, and sometimes the smallest trick conceals the largest fear. She rose, thanking him. He handed her the envelope, resealed. Best keep that safe, not something to scatter about the parlour. Outside, the sky had begun to pale again. Frost glittered on the edge of the church gate. She walked slowly, thinking, each step measured with quiet rhythm. Saltpeter and sugar, fire without flame, smoke without heat, A schoolboy's toti-and-o experiment, the doctor had said. But schoolboys did not attend the Women's Guild, and they did not order parcels marked cleaning compound. Miss Marple's breath misted in the cold air. She looked back toward the hall, her eyes narrowing slightly. Then who, she murmured, wanted the hall filled with poisoned air? Rain had returned by dusk, a soft drizzle that blurred the lamps along the lane. Miss Marple held her umbrella low, the drops pattering like small, patient questions. She made her way to Ivy Cottage. Mavis Green lived there, alone, in a tidy house smelling faintly of lavender and coal. Mavis opened the door with surprise, then relief. "Oh, Miss Marple, you've come about last night, haven't you?" Marple smiled gently. "Perhaps. I hear you may have seen something by the hall." Mavis nodded, ushering her in. "Come by the fire, dear. I'll tell you. But I'll warn you it wasn't much to see, not in that rain." The kettle whistled softly in the corner. The clock ticked. Outside, the drizzle pressed faintly against the panes. "I couldn't sleep," Mavis began, settling into her chair. "The wind had started up, you know. It rattles the back gate something awful. So I looked out." Miss Marple folded her hands, listening. Mavis spoke slowly, recalling each detail. "It was just past 10, maybe later. I saw someone moving near the vicarage hall, a lantern swinging low. I thought it was Ellen Preece. She's the one who always locks up after meetings. But something felt wrong." "Wrong?" Miss Marple asked softly. She was moving oddly, keeping close to the hedge, like she didn't want to be seen. I called out once, but she didn't answer. Then the lantern light vanished, and I thought, well, perhaps the wind blew it out." "You're certain it was Ellen?" Mavis hesitated. "At first, yes. Same height, same coat or so, I thought. But this morning Ellen said she'd been in bed all night with that dreadful cold. Her daughter even came by with broth." Miss Marple's needles rested still in her lap. "Did you tell anyone?" "Mrs. Fielding," Mavis said, lowering her voice. "She told me not to make a fuss. Said I must have imagined it. But I know what I saw. I don't dream lanterns." Miss Marple gave a small, kind nod. "The light," she said quietly. "Where exactly was it?" Mavis pointed toward the window. "Near the back door. Just there, where the deliveries come in. The rain was falling hard, but I remember the reflection bright gold against the wet ground. She, or whoever it was carrying something small in the other hand." "What sort of something?" Mavis frowned, thinking. "Square, like a parcel. Wrapped. Brown paper, I think." She was careful with it, kept it tucked close. A pause. The fire cracked. Outside, the rain softened, turning to mist. Miss Marple rose, adjusting her shawl. "You've been most helpful, my dear," she said warmly. "Even small memories can light a very dark place." Mavis smiled faintly, though her hands trembled around her teacup. She followed Miss Marple to the door. The air outside was cool, damp, and quiet. Miss Marple looked toward the distant vicarage, the windows dim behind the rain. Her voice dropped to a whisper, meant only for herself. "So who," she murmured, lit the lantern under the rain? Morning light crept through lace curtains. It fell in narrow bands across Miss Marple's table. Her teacup steamed gently beside the day's newspaper, but her thoughts were still in the vicarage hall. Something remained unfinished, something small and paper-thin. Secrets often hid best in plain sight. By mid-morning she was there again. Owen Little had left the door unlocked while airing out the hall. She stepped quietly inside. No sound but the faint creak of the floorboards. The air was cooler now, less heavy. Still, a faint trace of that strange sweetness lingered, like sugar burnt long ago. She moved slowly, eyes taking in every detail. Chairs stacked neatly, table bare, cupboard locked. Nothing to see, almost. Then she noticed the bin beside the window, half hidden behind a chair leg, paper scraps curled like old leaves inside. She bent down, pulling on her gloves. The smell of ash clung faintly to the rim. She lifted one torn sheet. Ink blurred, words half vanished. Accounts, missing funds, the rest unreadable. Her brows rose slightly. The writing, slanted, tight and shaky, belonged to Mrs. Doris Fielding. She knew it at once. That heavy downward stroke on these, the impatient flick at the end, a hand accustomed to control. Miss Marple laid the fragments on the table. The edges matched too cleanly to be accidental. A single page torn by deliberate fingers. Someone had wanted it gone, but not burned. The ink was fresh enough to smudge her glove. Written perhaps the night before the meeting. She imagined the scene. Mrs. Fielding alone, lamplight dim, writing fast, nervous. An entry gone wrong in the guild's accounts. A sum missing. A reason to hide it. She found another scrap, smaller, folded into itself. It bore only 2 words, roof repairs. Marple's eyes lingered on the phrase. Repairs that never happened. Money that vanished quietly between one signature and the next. Outside, a cart rolled past, iron wheels rumbling on cobblestone. The sound faded, leaving silence behind. Miss Marple pressed the pieces together. A picture was forming. Mrs. Fielding's authority. Her sudden fear. Her quick command to silence the guild. And now this. She looked toward the cupboard again. The locked door gleamed dully in the weak light. Inside it rested the teapot. The same one that had hissed and smoked like a warning. She tucked the torn paper into her knitting bag. Evidence, perhaps, or a confession that never reached its reader. Her mind moved quietly through possibilities. Guilt leaves a trail, she thought. Not always in footsteps. Sometimes in ink. Sometimes in the things people try to throw away. She walked to the door, pausing once to glance back at the tidy room. Nothing disturbed, nothing alive but memory. Her voice was a soft murmur against the stillness. Guilt was trying to erase itself. By afternoon, gossip had already softened. The village moved on quickly from scandal when told to. Mrs. Fielding had that gift she could hush a rumor before it found its legs. Miss Marple, however, preferred her rumors with legs. They tended to walk her straight toward the truth. She decided to call on Owen Little again. He was tightening the hinges on the hall door when she arrived. A quiet man, not fond of talk, but honest by habit. "Afternoon, Mr. Little," she said kindly. "I hope your boiler's behaving today," he grunted, "as well as any cursed thing built before the war." Then, with a sideways glance, "You back for more of that business from the meeting?" "Not at all," she said mildly. "Only a trifle of curiosity. People tell me Mrs. Fielding left early that evening. Around 8, I believe?" Owen frowned. "That's what she told the others, but I don't see how." "Oh?" He leaned against the doorframe. "When I closed up, her coat was still hanging by the hook. I remember because I was locking the windows and nearly took it for mine. Same color. You see, navy blue." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked once inside her bag. "You locked up after 9? "Closer to past," he said. "Mrs. Fielding wasn't there. But her coat was." She looked thoughtful. "Then who locked the back door, I wonder?" He rubbed his chin. "I did the front, yes. But when I went round to check the back, it was already bolted. I thought she might have done it before she left. Didn't think more of it." "Yet you didn't see her go?" "No, just her car missing by morning." Miss Marple nodded, the faintest smile touching her lips. Details. Always small, always stubborn. They never stayed quiet for long. Owen picked up his tools again. "Funny thing," he added after a pause. "I could have sworn I heard the latch twice that night. Once when I came through, and again later, just as I was leaving. Thought it was the wind." "Or another key," she murmured. He blinked. "Beg pardon?" She smiled pleasantly. "Nothing at all. Just idle musing." He shrugged, muttered something about drafts, and returned to his work. Miss Marple turned toward the notice board. Fresh paper pinned up ladies' choir, practice cancelled. Written in Mrs. Fielding's neat hand. She traced the loops of the letters lightly. The ink was barely dry. So she had come back then. Sometime after 9. Sometime after the caretaker had gone. And she had written a notice while the hall stood empty. Why return, unless something waited to be hidden? The teapot in the cupboard. The ledger with its missing figures. And now, a locked door that no one truly locked. Miss Marple stepped outside into the fading light. The church bell began its slow toll across the valley. She walked down the lane, eyes soft, mind sharp. A key, she whispered to herself, was used twice, once for entry, once for escape. The chemist's bell tinkled as Miss Marple stepped inside. Warm air met her, thick with the smell of menthol and soap. Shelves gleamed in perfect order, bottles, jars, and boxes labelled in neat rows. Behind the counter stood Mr. Pratt, spectacles perched halfway down his nose. He looked up and smiled faintly. "Well, if it isn't Miss Marple," he said. "Out in this weather again? Don't tell me you've caught a chill." She smiled. "Not yet, Mr. Pratt. I've come for information, not medicine." He raised an eyebrow. "That's rarer, and usually more expensive." She laughed softly, unoffended. "Perhaps you can recall something for me. A few days ago, Mrs. Doris Fielding visited you, I believe." He nodded without hesitation. "Indeed. Wednesday morning. Bought a few things, nothing unusual. A jar of beeswax, a small tin of saltpeter." "Saltpeter," Miss Marple repeated quietly. "For what purpose?" "Polishing silver," she said. "I warned her. Of course it burns if mixed wrong." She only smiled and said she was careful. Miss Marple's eyes moved over the spotless counter. "Saltpeter and wax make a curious polish." "Quite so," Mr. Pratt agreed. "I even told her she could buy ready-made cleaner. But she said she preferred her own method. Claimed it made things shine brighter." "Did she mention what she planned to clean?" He thought for a moment. "No, but she was in a hurry. Paid in cash, exact change. Always precise. That one. Though she did seem distracted. Dropped her glove on the way out. I called after her, but she didn't hear." Miss Marple nodded slowly. That fit. Mrs. Fielding had always been the model of precision, but fear unbalances even the most polished souls. She ran a gloved finger over a brass jar on the counter. "You keep good records, I assume?" "Every transaction," Mr. Pratt said proudly, opening his ledger. He flipped a page. "Here, Wednesday. Mrs. D. Fielding beeswax, saltpeter, glycerin tablets." "Glycerin too?" "Yes, for her hands," she said. "Dry skin. But it struck me later. That combination wax, saltpeter, glycerin. It's no polishing recipe I've ever known." Miss Marple gave a quiet hum. "An experiment, perhaps. Or a disguise." He looked puzzled. "Disguise?" "Oh, nothing sinister, Mr. Pratt. Only that people sometimes buy ordinary things to hide extraordinary intentions." She thanked him kindly, then paused at the door. The bell chimed softly above her head. She turned back. Once more. "One last question," she said gently. "When she left, which direction did she go?" "Toward the hall," he said without thinking. "Straight down the lane. She didn't even open her umbrella." Outside, rain had begun again, thin and silver in the light. Miss Marple walked slowly, her mind weaving quiet threads together. Saltpeter, wax, glycerine, a false polish, a teapot that smoked, and a woman desperate to clean what couldn't be scrubbed away. Her eyes softened, though her thoughts were sharp as pins. She was polishing her reputation, she whispered, with combustion. The day was quiet enough for thinking. A slow wind drifted through the garden, shaking the bare roses. Miss Marple sat by her kitchen table, sleeves rolled, eyes steady. Before her lay a small glass dish, a spoon, a matchbox, and 3 tiny packets labelled in her own handwriting. Saltpeter, sugar, wax, scrapings. The air smelled faintly of starch and old paper. From outside came the sound of church bells, soft and distant. The hour had come for a little experiment. She worked carefully, like a seamstress threading a dangerous needle. A pinch of saltpeter, half that of sugar, a shaving of wax, barely a crumb. She stirred them together with a teaspoon. The grains caught the light, harmless and pale. Then she paused. Her mind wandered briefly to the Women's Guild, to the laughter, to Mrs. Fielding's calm command, and to the way that calm had cracked the moment the teapot smoked. Marple set the small mixture into an old teacup. It had a chip along the rim, one she'd kept for moments like these. She struck the match. The flame quivered once before catching. A faint hiss followed, then smoke, thick, grey, slow to rise, slow to fade. The smell filled the air, sweet at first, then sharp. Exactly the same scent that had curled through the vicarage hall. Sugar burnt into bitterness. A tang of chemical sting that prickled the from's nose. She stepped back, waving a hand gently. The smoke spread evenly, steady and controlled. Not a fire's rage, a reaction's patience. It did not flare. It waited. It lingered. She opened the window, letting the wind carry the haze into the garden. Her cat fled the room with quiet indignation. Marple smiled faintly. "Yes," she murmured. "That would do it." She poured a little water into the cup, extinguishing the rest. The mixture hissed once more and died with a soft sigh. Proof, plain as daylight. She cleaned the table slowly, placing every item back into its proper place. No chaos, no drama, just order restored. She thought again of Mrs. Fielding, the parcel from Dover, the cleaning compound, the late-night visit to the hall, the locked door. It was all so tidy. Too tidy. Every step planned to the minute. Smoke to distract, not destroy. A room filled with confusion while evidence vanished quietly in the corner. She could see it now, the deliberate accident, the convenient chaos. And beneath it, fear wearing the mask of control. She sat down again, hands folded. Her eyes softened, but her mind did not. The teacup sat before her, still faintly warm. Its rim was blackened in a single ring. She ran a finger over it, thoughtful. "No tea," she whispered. "No comfort. Only design." Outside, the bells fell silent. The air cleared. Only the faint, sweet trace of smoke remained a ghost of proof. Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the clock, ticking evenly above the stove. "It was never about tea," she said softly. "It was about timing." The afternoon light slanted low across the churchyard. Gravestones glimmered with frost, and the air bit gently at the skin. Miss Marple walked with her shawl pulled close, step steady, mind alert. She had asked to see the Guild's minute book. Officially, she said, to help with next week's raffle records. Unofficially, she sought something else. Something small, perhaps torn, perhaps forgotten. Mrs. Fielding's assistant, young Beatrice, met her at the vicarage door. She was polite, though nervous. "The books are kept in the study, Miss Marple," she said. "I'll fetch them." Marple followed her inside. The room smelled of beeswax and old paper. Ledgers stood in neat rows across the shelf, each labelled by year. Everything orderly, precise, Mrs. Fielding's touch in every inch. Beatrice handed her the thick, leather-bound minute book. "Last year's," she explained. Marple smiled gently. "Thank you, my dear. That will do." The pages turned with a faint crackle, each meeting recorded in perfect script. Attendance, notes, motions, finances, all beautifully neat. Until halfway through the book, a torn page, ragged edge, ink faintly smeared along the cut, the space where numbers had once been. Miss Marple bent closer. The remaining ink showed only fragments. Roof repairs, approved sum, £10. She turned the page. The next entry carried on without mention. No follow-up, no receipt, just silence. Her lips pressed together. In a small village, £10 was not a fortune, but it was enough to tempt pride, enough to stir fear when accounted wrongly. Beatrice hovered nearby. "Everything in order?" she asked nervously. Marple smiled kindly. "Oh, yes, my dear, just as expected, though I see there was some work done on the roof." Beatrice frowned. "Roof repairs? I don't think so. Mr. Little said the leak never got fixed. He used a bucket instead." Marple nodded, eyes on the missing page. "Ah, a practical solution. Cheaper, too." She closed the book carefully. Beatrice exhaled in relief. "Mrs. Fielding likes everything tidy," she said. "She says order keeps people's minds off trouble." "Does it?" Marple murmured. "Sometimes I think order only hides it better." Beatrice blinked, unsure how to answer. Marple patted her arm. You're very helpful, my dear. Don't trouble Mrs. Fielding with my questions. When she stepped back into the cold, the air felt clearer. The church bell tolled 4. Each note echoed across the square. Miss Marple paused under the lich gate, opening her knitting bag. Inside lay the torn scraps from the wastebasket, and now her mental image of the missing page joined them. A tidy sum, a vanished repair, and a woman who'd rather rewrite numbers than confess need. She sighed softly. "Pride costs more than thieves," she murmured. The wind lifted a corner of her shawl, tugging it playfully. She drew it close again, her eyes glinting in thought. The truth was forming in figures, in ink, in guilt. And as she walked away, the sound of the church bell faded behind her. She whispered the thought aloud, quiet as prayer. The book held a confession in numbers. The evening light softened over the green. Shadows stretched long across the vicarage yard. Miss Marple walked slowly toward the hall, her shawl drawn tight, her step light on the damp path. Inside, the smell of polish lingered. Owen Little was at work again, rubbing the brass hinges of the door. He glanced up as she entered. "Evening, Miss Marple," he said. "If you've come about that teapot, it's been locked away for good." She smiled. "Not the teapot, Mr. Little, only a memory or two." He chuckled softly. "My memory's no good to anyone, not these days." "Oh, I think it's better than you say," she replied kindly. She watched him work for a moment. His movements were neat, deliberate, the habit of a man who noticed small things. "Tell me," she said at last. "You've worked here long, haven't you?" 23 years, he said proudly. "Seen 4 vicars, 2 bishops, and 100 meetings that could have been letters." "Then you must have seen many quarrels too," she said lightly. He looked up, surprised. "What makes—" "You ask that?" "Observation," she murmured. "They say Mrs. Fielding and Ellen Preece were not always in harmony." Owen paused, his cloth stilled mid-polish. After a moment, he sighed. "You might say that." He set down the rag. "It was 2 nights before the meeting," he began. "They were in the hall, thought they were alone, but I was in the back storeroom fixing a hinge." He rubbed his hands together, eyes narrowed in memory. "I heard Mrs. Fielding's voice first, sharp, like a whip. 'You will not make this public,' she said. 'You understand me?' 'And Ellen?' She was crying. Poor woman. Said something about honesty, about it being wrong to hide what was done. Mrs. Fielding told her to keep her mouth shut or she'd regret it." Miss Marple nodded, eyes thoughtful. "Did she sound angry?" "Angry, yes, but frightened too. There's a difference, you know. Anger shouts, fear trembles." He picked up the rag again, but his hands trembled faintly now. "I didn't mean to listen," he said quietly. "But when I heard the door slam, I looked out." Mrs. Fielding left first, face white as chalk. Ellen sat at the table, crying like a child. Then she tore a piece of paper in half. "A letter?" Marple asked softly. "Could have been. I only saw the bits drop into the bin." Her gaze deepened. The torn letter. The same one she had found, smudged with ink. She thanked him gently. He gave a faint nod, relief in his eyes now that the story was told. Outside, the air had turned heavy again. Low clouds gathered, dark with coming rain. Miss Marple looked back once at the glowing windows of the hall. 2 women, 2 secrets, 1 desperate silence. She drew her shawl tighter, her voice no more than a whisper. "One of them would choose silence," she said, "the other smoke." The vicarage hall stood quiet again. Afternoon lights slanted through the high windows, cutting pale bars across the floor. Dust floated in the beams, slow as snow. Miss Marple moved softly through the empty space. The tables were stacked, the chairs neat against the wall. Nothing looked amiss, and yet the air held a memory of something hidden. She paused near the cupboard. The same cupboard Mrs. Fielding had locked so quickly after the meeting. Its door was polished smooth, the brass handle faintly smudged. A small keyhole glimmered at her eye level. She smiled faintly. Keys, like secrets, always found their way back to where they didn't belong. From her knitting bag she drew a small pin. Not proper lock-picking, just the quiet art of persuasion. A moment's careful pressure, a soft click, and the latch gave way. The scent met her first faint tea and old wood, with something sharper beneath. Inside, the shelves gleamed with orderly china. Cups, saucers, teapots, all shining, all innocent. But behind them, something out of place. A small jar labeled beeswax, ordinary enough, yet the glass was smudged, as if handled in haste. She lifted it carefully. The lid came away with a faint crack. Inside, not golden wax but a pale residue, rough and crystalline. She touched it lightly with a spoon. The same dull shimmer, the same faint sparkle she'd seen on the ledger, the same sharp tang that stung the nose. Saltpeter, traces of sugar, the same deadly simplicity. She replaced the lid gently, setting the jar aside. Something fluttered beneath it, a small scrap of fabric, folded twice. She lifted it. The texture was soft, the color browned by tea. It smelled faintly of leaves and smoke. A cloth from the teapot's base, perhaps, or the rag used to wipe its edge after the reaction had begun. Her fingers pressed it between thumb and forefinger, still faintly sticky, still faintly warm, though the crime itself had cooled. Mrs. Fielding's voice echoed in her mind. "Will not alarm the village." Ah, but the village was already alarmed. It simply hadn't realized by whom. Marple studied the cupboard again. So neat, so precise. The perfect place to hide a mistake. Among china and comfort, no one would look for danger. People rarely search the ordinary. They trust it too much. She stood back, closing the door quietly. The latch clicked once more, its secret restored. Outside, a clock struck 3, each note crisp and clean. Miss Marple straightened her shawl, her eyes thoughtful. The jar, the cloth, the lie disguised as housework, all placed exactly where she'd expect a proud woman to hide her guilt beside her best china, beneath her reputation. She turned toward the doorway, her voice a soft murmur lost to the echoing hall. She hid the evidence, Miss Marple said, where she kept the china. The afternoon was heavy with quiet. Clouds pressed low over the village, sealing in the stillness. Miss Marple walked the lane toward Elm House, Mrs. Fielding's residence, and the tidiest house in St. Mary Me. White curtains, trimmed hedges, everything perfectly in place. The home of a woman who needed control like air. The maid answered the door, startled but polite. "Mrs. Fielding is resting," she said. "I won't disturb her," Miss Marple replied. "Just a few words, 5 minutes at most." The maid hesitated, then nodded, and stepped aside. Miss Marple entered the drawing room, where sunlight fell across the china cabinet and polished floors. Mrs. Doris Fielding sat upright in her armchair, gloved hands folded neatly in her lap. A half-drunk cup of tea cooled beside her. "Miss Marple," she said thinly. "How unexpected. I trust all is well." "Quite well," Marple answered gently. "I only came to return a few things and to ask a small favor." She opened her knitting bag and set 3 items on the table, a folded scrap of fabric, a torn letter, and a small jar labeled beeswax. Mrs. Fielding's face froze. Color drained from her cheeks, leaving a pallor beneath the powder. "I found these in the hall cupboard," Miss Marple continued, her voice calm. "I dare say they belong to the guild, though they seem misfiled." Mrs. Fielding didn't speak. Her gloved fingers tightened around the chair's arms. The faint creak of leather broke the silence. Miss Marple sat down opposite her, unhurried. She spoke as though discussing tea blends, not evidence. "The jar, of course, once held wax, but it holds something else now, something that smokes rather impressively when warmed. I'm told it's a mixture of saltpeter and sugar." No response, just a faint tremor at the corner of Mrs. Fielding's mouth. "And this cloth," Miss Marple went on softly, "smells of tea and of that same sweet smoke. It must have touched the teapot after the accident." Still no answer, only the sound of the mantel clock, ticking evenly between them. Marple leaned forward, hands folded. "Then there's the matter of the ledger. £10 for roof repairs that were never made, and the torn letter in your handwriting accounts. Missing funds. Mrs. Fielding swallowed hard. Her eyes flicked toward the window, then back. For a moment, she seemed to shrink inside her chair. People sometimes act from fear, Miss Marple said gently. Fear of losing face, fear of discovery. But truth has a way of leaking through the finest polish. Mrs. Fielding's throat worked, but no words came. Her lips parted, then closed again. A single tear slipped down her cheek and darkened the edge of her glove. Miss Marple rose quietly. She gathered her things, giving the woman her silence. No lecture, no victory, only the weight of what was already understood. At the door she paused and looked back once more. Mrs. Fielding sat perfectly still, eyes lowered, hands gripping the arms of her chair, not moving, not speaking. Her silence filled the room. It said everything words could not, and as Miss Marple stepped into the fading light, she thought softly. Her silence was louder than any confession. The wind had turned colder by morning. Frost lined the garden walls outside Elm House. Miss Marple returned, this time not with curiosity but certainty. The maid looked nervous as she opened the door. "Mrs. Fielding isn't well," she whispered. "She's taken no breakfast. Then she may need tea," Miss Marple said softly. "I'll see her just a moment." The drawing room looked much the same. Fire low, curtains drawn against the light. Mrs. Fielding sat where she had before, upright, composed but smaller somehow. Her gloves were gone. Her hands, bare and pale, twisted the edge of a handkerchief. "Miss Marple," she said faintly, "I suppose you've come to finish what you started." "Not at all," Marple replied gently. "I came to understand." For a long moment, the clock ticked between them. No other sound filled the house. Mrs. Fielding looked up. Her eyes were tired, ringed in grey. "There's little to understand," she said. "I did what I had to. A small thing. A mistake." Marple nodded. "Mistakes are only small until they spread. Would you like to tell me why?" Something in her voice broke through the other woman's pride. A tremor passed through Mrs. Fielding's lips. "I took the money," she whispered. £10. From the Guild Fund. "For yourself?" "For my son," she said quickly. Her voice rose, desperate. "He'd borrowed from the wrong people. They were threatening to ruin him. I thought just a loan, only until the next month's accounts." Marple's eyes softened. "And when Ellen found out?" Mrs. Fielding flinched. She said she'd speak to the vicar. She didn't understand what it would mean. "My reputation, the guild, everything I've worked for, so I—" Her voice faltered. "I thought to frighten her, to make a small accident, something to draw attention elsewhere. Smoke, confusion, and in the fuss, I'd destroy the ledger. No harm done." "No harm done," Marple repeated quietly, "except that accidents have a life of their own." Mrs. Fielding nodded miserably. "I thought it safe. A little smoke, a bit of wax and saltpeter. But Ellen was closer than I knew. She could have died, Miss Marple." The words hung heavy in the air. Marple said nothing. Sometimes silence was kinder than judgment. "I didn't expect you," Mrs. Fielding whispered. "Didn't expect anyone to notice the smell. You caught it in an instant." "Truth," said Marple softly, "has its own scent." Mrs. Fielding looked down at her hands. "I didn't mean for it to go so far. I only wanted to keep my name clean." Marple rose slowly, her shawl falling into place around her shoulders. "Cleanliness," she said gently, "is not the same as purity." Tears welled, but Mrs. Fielding did not sob. She only sat there, hollow, the confession draining the strength from her face. Outside, the clock struck noon. The sound echoed through the house, steady and final. Miss Marple turned toward the door, voice calm, almost kind. "Your sin was not greed," she said quietly. "It was fear." The morning after the confession felt strangely calm. Rain had washed the streets clean, leaving the cobblestones bright as mirrors. Inside the vicarage hall, a hush lingered, not of shock, but of quiet shame. Inspector Slack arrived without ceremony. His boots left small puddles on the polished floor. He removed his hat, nodded once to Miss Marple and said nothing more than, "Best get on with it." Mrs. Fielding waited in her drawing room. Her hands were folded neatly, as though waiting for a church hymn to begin. No tears, no protest. Only that calm, brittle dignity she wore like armor. Slack spoke gently. "I'm afraid I must ask you to come along, ma'am." She rose at once, pale but steady. "I expected as much," she said softly. Her voice did not waver, but her fingers twisted the edge of her handkerchief until it nearly tore. Marple stood quietly in the corner, no pleasure in her face, no victory, only a kind sadness, the sort reserved for those who trap themselves. The door closed behind them, the sound echoed once, then faded. By midday the guild gathered again. Chairs arranged in their usual circle, voices lowered. Ellen Preece poured tea with trembling hands. Mavis Green whispered prayers she didn't quite believe, and everyone in that small, tidy hall avoided saying the name that hovered over every cup. Miss Marple entered quietly, shawl damp from the mist. She smiled faintly, reassuringly, and took her place beside Lady Bantry, who waited with her usual curiosity disguised as sympathy. "Well," Lady Bantry murmured, "it's all rather dreadful, isn't it? You'd think Doris would have known better." Marple stirred her tea slowly. "She knew better," she said softly. "She simply thought knowledge would save her. But truth, once it begins to burn, will not stop." Lady Bantry sighed. "She'll have to face court, I suppose." "Yes, but I think her punishment began long before the police arrived." They sat together in the quiet hum of the room. Outside, the church bell tolled the hour, steady and clear. Each sound drifted through the open window like a memory being measured. Ellen approached with the tray again. Her hands were steadier now. "More tea, Miss Marple?" "Just half a cup, dear." The teapot poured, the steam curling softly in the air. A gentle hiss. Nothing dangerous now, just the comfort of ordinary life returning. Marple looked at it for a long moment, her eyes distant. Then she spoke, almost to herself. "It's strange," she said, "how truth hides in the simplest things. In ink, in ash, in the curl of smoke no one notices." Lady Bantry tilted her head. "Smoke?" Marple smiled faintly. "Smoke never truly lies. It tells you where the fire was, even after everyone forgets." The clock ticked. Outside, a wisp of chimney smoke rose into the grey sky, fading slow but certain. Miss Marple set down her cup and said quietly, "Smoke is just truth trying to escape too late." Evening drifted over St. Mary Me, soft and gold. The church bell gave its final chime, gentle and tired. Inside her cottage, Miss Marple moved slowly, settling into her chair. The kettle hummed its small, comforting song. Steam rose in graceful curls, like thoughts escaping the mind. She poured her tea, steady and calm. The village was quiet again. The scandal folded itself neatly into memory like laundry tucked away in drawers. She looked toward the window. Beyond the lace curtain, chimney smoke curled up into twilight. Her voice was almost a whisper. "Evil rarely arrives with a roar," she said. "It seeps, like steam." The cup warmed her hands. The moment lingered, still and knowing. Then she smiled faintly. And somewhere, in another quiet village, her eyes softened. Another secret waits.